The great crystal dome of the Galactic Council chamber sparkled under 3 distant suns. Inside, hundreds of alien beings sat in massive circles, their voices echoing off ancient walls. This was where the galaxy's most powerful species gathered to solve problems and prevent wars. Ambassador Thomas Blake stood at a small podium, his human uniform looking plain compared to the colorful robes and armor worn by other delegates. He was 53 years old with gray hair and tired eyes. Behind him sat Emily Harrison, his assistant, who kept checking her datapad nervously. Thomas cleared his throat and spoke to the council. His voice was steady even though his heart was racing. 3 human cargo ships had accidentally entered the wrong space sector last week because they were using old star maps. It was an honest mistake, nothing more. Thomas had come to apologize and offer to pay for any inconvenience caused. Before he could finish explaining, a booming voice cut him off like a thunderclap. A massive figure stood up from across the chamber. Warlord Marcus Kravish was over 7 feet tall with dark armor covering his muscular body. His species, the Zelthan, looked like they were born for battle. Marcus had scars on his face and burning anger in his eyes. His red cape flowed behind him as he pointed one clawed finger at Thomas. The warlord's voice shook the walls as he shouted that humanity had insulted the mighty Zelthan Empire. He claimed the 3 human ships had deliberately invaded their territory to show disrespect. The Zelthan Empire had ruled for 12,000 years, he roared, and they would not tolerate such behavior from primitives who had barely learned to leave their own star system. Thomas tried to interrupt politely. He explained again that it was just a navigation error. The maps humanity bought from a trader were outdated. They meant no harm and were willing to make things right. Marcus laughed, a cruel sound that made several delegates look away uncomfortably. He mocked the idea of accepting money from weak humans. The Zelthan did not need charity from a species so pathetic they only controlled 3 small colonies. Humanity had been part of the galactic community for just 30 years. The Zelthan controlled 4 to 7 entire star systems and commanded thousands of warships. Emily leaned close to Thomas and whispered urgently that Marcus was planning something worse than a simple complaint. This was not about the ships anymore. The warlord wanted to make an example of humanity to show the whole galaxy how powerful the Zelthan were. Thomas felt a cold weight settle in his stomach. He knew she was right. Marcus raised both arms high above his head. The entire council chamber fell silent, as if everyone had stopped breathing at once. In a voice that carried to every corner of the massive room, the warlord made his declaration. By the authority given to him by the Zelthan Emperor, he announced that a state of war now existed between the Zelthan Empire and the human species. Gasps and shocked whispers rippled through the crowd. War declarations were extremely rare in modern times. Most problems were solved through negotiations or small penalties. An actual war had not been declared in nearly 100 years. Marcus continued his speech, describing how humanity would have 1 week to surrender all 3 of their colonies and every ship they owned. If humans refused, the Zelthan military would take everything by force and enslave the survivors. He turned to address all the other species watching, telling them this would be a lesson about what happened to weak civilizations that dared to question the strong. The warlord described humanity's military in mocking detail. Humans still used primitive chemical rockets and simple kinetic weapons that shot metal bullets. Meanwhile, the Zelthan wielded advanced plasma weapons that could melt through starship hulls and exotic energy systems that could tear apart molecules. The largest human warship was smaller than a medium Zelthan destroyer. Marcus declared that this would not even be a real war, just a quick extermination to teach the galaxy a lesson about power. Many delegates from species allied with the Zelthan nodded in agreement. Everyone knew the Zelthan military reputation was well earned. They had conquered 14 star systems in the past century alone. No one had successfully stood against them for long. Thomas Blake took a slow, deep breath. He felt the weight of 11 billion human lives pressing down on his shoulders. Every person living on Earth and the 3 colony worlds was depending on what he said next. His next words would determine whether humanity survived or became a footnote in galactic history. In a calm, clear voice that carried surprising authority, Thomas announced that humanity accepted the Zelthan declaration of war. Marcus began to smile triumphantly, but Thomas was not finished speaking. However, Thomas continued, humanity would not surrender. Instead, 1 human ship would meet the Zelthan fleet at the edge of human territory. They would settle this matter there in open space where the entire Galactic Council could witness what happened through observation satellites. The chamber erupted in confused murmuring. 1 ship? Against the entire Zelthan armada? Was the human ambassador insane? Marcus threw his head back and laughed so hard his whole body shook. The sound echoed off the crystal dome above. He called it an insult that humanity would send just one pitiful vessel to face 200 of the finest warships in the galaxy. But fine, he declared with contempt dripping from every word, the humans could send their pathetic ship. It would be the first to explode when the Zelthan fleet swept through human space like an unstoppable storm. Marcus promised he would personally ensure that the wreckage of that one human ship would become a monument to human stupidity and a warning to anyone else who might dare challenge Zelthan's superiority. Thomas gathered his papers with steady hands despite everything. Emily stood beside him, her face pale but determined. As they walked toward the exit, they could hear Marcus behind them already organizing his fleet commanders and boasting loudly about the coming conquest. Delegates from dozens of species watched the two humans leave. Some looked at them with pity, as if watching dead people walking. Others showed morbid curiosity about what would happen when such mismatched forces collided. As Thomas and Emily passed through the doorway into the corridor outside, an old friend reached out and touched Thomas's arm. Ambassador Stella Morgan from the Viridian Assembly had known Thomas for years. Her voice was filled with genuine concern as she told him this was suicide. Marcus commanded 200 warships while humanity's entire fleet numbered only 12 small vessels. Even if Thomas sent every ship humanity owned, they would be outnumbered and outgunned by a massive margin. Thomas met her worried eyes, and Stella was surprised to see not fear in his expression but something that looked almost like quiet confidence. Thomas told her that sometimes the size of the fleet mattered less than what that fleet could actually do. He asked her to trust him. They continued walking, leaving Stella standing in the hallway looking confused and worried. Once they were safely inside their private diplomatic transport flying away from the council building, Emily finally spoke up. Her voice shook as she asked if Thomas had really just committed to sending a single ship against 200 Zelthan warships. Thomas stared out the window at the alien city passing below them. He answered quietly that yes, he had made that commitment. Emily wanted to know which ship. Humanity only had 12 military vessels, and none were designed for large fleet battles. The Zelthan would tear through any human frigate in seconds. Thomas was silent for a long moment, then spoke the name of the ship softly. The Resolute. He told Emily to send an emergency message to Admiral Patricia Cole at Fleet Command using the highest security codes. Captain James Mitchell and his crew needed to prepare for immediate launch. The authorization code was Prometheus Black. Emily's eyes went wide with shock. That ship was still experimental, she protested. The test runs had only been 60% successful. The fabrication systems were untested in real combat. The power output could become unstable and destroy the ship from within. Thomas admitted he knew all the risks. He understood that they were betting everything on untested technology. But the Zelthan had given humanity no other choice. Marcus wanted to make an example of humans to show the entire galaxy that humanity could be easily pushed around and destroyed. Thomas had to show them something very different. He had to show everyone that humanity was not prey. Emily asked what would happen if the experimental systems failed. If the Resolute was destroyed, what then? Thomas turned to face her with heavy sadness in his eyes. Then they would have lost one ship instead of their entire fleet, he answered. But he had faith in Captain Mitchell. And he had faith in human creativity and stubbornness. Humans had faced extinction many times before through wars, diseases, and disasters. Every single time, humanity had survived by adapting and building something new from the ruins. He looked back out at the stars visible beyond the alien cityscape. Thomas told Emily to inform James that the galaxy was about to learn what humanity did best. Emily asked what that was. Thomas allowed himself a small, grim smile as he answered. Humanity built things that lasted. Things that survived. Things that could not be stopped by brute force alone. The transport flew on through the alien sky, carrying two humans who had just gambled their entire species' future on one experimental ship and one untested captain. Behind them, Marcus Kravesh was assembling the largest Zelthan war fleet seen in decades, confident that crushing humanity would be simple and quick. Neither side fully understood what was about to happen. Neither side knew that the confrontation brewing at the edge of human space would change galactic politics forever. And neither side could predict that the outcome would reshape how every civilization in the galaxy thought about war, peace, and power. The die was cast. The challenge was made. In 1 week, the Resolute would face the Zelthan Armada. Only time would tell if humanity's desperate gamble would save them or doom them to extinction. The edge of human territory was marked by a single blinking beacon, a lonely satellite floating in the darkness of space. Beyond it lay empty void separating human colonies from the rest of the galaxy. This buffer zone had kept humanity safe and isolated for 3 decades. Now it would become a battlefield. Captain James Mitchell stood on the bridge of the Resolute, staring at the countdown timer. In 8 minutes, the Zelthan fleet would arrive. His ship sat exactly where they had promised to be, waiting alone in the vast emptiness. James was 41 years old with brown hair turning grey at the temples. He was an engineer by training, not a warrior. He had spent most of his career building space stations and managing construction projects. Now he commanded humanity's most experimental vessel, and the fate of 11 billion people rested on whether his untested systems would actually work. The bridge crew worked quietly at their stations. 23 people total aboard the ship, most of them engineers and technicians rather than soldiers. Lieutenant William Carter monitored the massive reactors humming deep in the ship's core. Ensign Rachel Moore kept both hands on the flight controls, ready to move if ordered. Everyone was tense, trying not to show their fear. The tactical display lit up with warnings. Lieutenant Daniel Foster announced in a tight voice that he detected ships emerging from faster-than-light travel. Multiple contacts. Very many contacts. Range 200,000 kilometers and closing fast. James ordered the main view screen activated. What appeared made Rachel gasp out loud despite her training. Ships. Hundreds of them. They materialized out of nothing in perfect military formation, appearing like sharks emerging from dark water. Destroyer wings flanked cruiser groups, all surrounding 4 massive dreadnoughts that looked like flying fortresses. Each dreadnought was over 2 kilometers long, bristling with weapon arrays that glowed with barely contained power. The Zelthan armada had arrived, and it was terrifying. Daniel worked frantically at his console, counting and classifying the enemy force. 200 vessels confirmed. 120 destroyers, 60 cruisers, 16 heavy cruisers, and 4 dreadnoughts. Total firepower equivalent to 400 terawatts of destructive energy. They were arranging into standard Zelthan attack formation, weapons charging, ready to annihilate anything in their path. The Resolute looked pathetically small by comparison. 300 meters long, cylindrical, with a dull gray hull. No obvious weapons. No impressive armor. Just one lonely ship facing an armada that could destroy planets. The communications console chimed. The Zelthan were calling. James straightened his uniform and ordered the call put through. Warlord Marcus Kravesh's scarred face filled the screen. He looked even more imposing than he had at the council, wearing full battle armor and surrounded by officers on the bridge of his flagship. Marcus stared at James with contempt and mockery in his eyes. The warlord announced that James was in violation of Zelthan space and ordered the Resolute to power down immediately and prepare to be boarded. His tone made it clear he expected instant obedience. James pointed out politely that they were actually in neutral space at the edge of human territory, exactly where Marcus had demanded they meet. They were not violating anything. Marcus's expression darkened with anger. He told James not to play word games. Humanity had been given a chance to surrender peacefully. Marcus suggested James take that offer now. Power down the ship, and he would allow the crew to live as prisoners rather than die in the next few minutes. James offered a counterproposal in a calm voice. Marcus could turn his fleet around, return to Zelthan space, and they could pretend this incident never happened. The alternative would not be pleasant for anyone involved. For a moment, Marcus simply stared in disbelief. Then he began laughing, a harsh mocking sound that echoed through both bridges. He asked if James was actually giving him an ultimatum. Marcus commanded 200 warships with enough firepower to sterilize every human colony in days. James sat in an unarmed construction vessel with a crew of engineers. What possible threat could one ship pose to an entire armada? James leaned forward slightly and spoke quietly but firmly. He said he was trying to save lives, including Marcus's life. The Resolute might look like a simple construction vessel, but appearances could be deceiving. James asked Marcus, as one military professional to another, to reconsider his course of action. Nothing good would come from this battle. Marcus's amusement vanished, replaced by cold fury. He asked if James dared to threaten him. Marcus had conquered 14 star systems. He had destroyed fleets 10 times larger than humanity's entire navy. He had reduced entire civilizations to rubble. What made James think one ship could stand against that? James replied simply that humanity had prepared for this moment. They had spent 8 years building something the Zelthan could not counter with conventional military force. Humanity did not fight the way Marcus expected them to. Marcus snarled at him to prove it. Show this magnificent weapon that would supposedly save humanity. From where Marcus sat, he saw only one helpless ship about to become debris floating in space. James glanced at William, who gave a subtle nod. All systems ready. This was the moment of truth. James offered one final chance. Return to Zelthan space and they would resolve this through diplomatic channels. Refuse, and they would settle it right here, right now, with the entire galaxy watching through Council observation satellites. Marcus's response was to gesture sharply to someone off-screen. His voice became a roar as he ordered his entire fleet to open fire. All ships, weapons free. He wanted the human vessel reduced to atoms within 60 seconds. The transmission cut out abruptly. James took a slow breath and gave orders rapidly. All crew to battle stations. William was to bring shields to maximum power and activate the energy absorption grid. Rachel was to hold their position without moving. They were not running away. Daniel was to prepare defensive platform deployment on James's command. Daniel warned nervously that they were about to receive fire from over 100 ships simultaneously. That was more firepower than most species had in their entire military. James replied calmly that he knew, and that was exactly what they wanted. He reminded William that every joule of energy the Zelthan threw at them would be power the Resolute could use. The more they shot, the stronger humanity's ship would become. On the tactical display, red icons representing Zelthan ships began glowing brighter as their weapons charged to full power. Plasma lances that could melt mountains. Antimatter torpedoes that could crack moons. Quantum disruptors that could tear apart matter at the atomic level. Every weapon in the Zelthan arsenal aimed at one small ship. Daniel reported with barely controlled fear that energy signatures were spiking off his sensors. The Zelthan were not holding back anything. This was going to be everything they had, all at once. James said quietly that this was good. Let them see what happened when they shot at something designed to eat energy instead of being destroyed by it. The first wave hit like the fist of an angry god. 12 plasma lances converged on the Resolute from different angles simultaneously. Each one was a stream of superheated matter hotter than the surface of a star. They struck the ship at the same instant, creating a sphere of brilliant light visible for light years in every direction. Any normal warship would have been vaporized instantly. Even heavy cruisers with reinforced shields would have suffered catastrophic damage and exploded. The Resolute barely noticed. A shimmering field materialized around the ship like a soap bubble made of light. The energy absorption grid activated at full capacity. The plasma lances hit the barrier and simply stopped. Their tremendous destructive energy was captured, converted, and channeled directly into the ship's power systems like water flowing into a reservoir. William reported with amazement in his voice that shields were holding at 100%. Better than holding, actually. The energy absorption grid was working perfectly. They had just absorbed approximately 12 terawatts of directed energy, and the reactors were already converting it to useful power. Current output had jumped from 80 terawatts to 140 terawatts and was still climbing. James ordered them to maintain position. He wanted to see what else the Zelthan had to throw at them. The enemy fleet did not disappoint. Antimatter torpedoes launched by the dozens, each one carrying enough explosive force to crack a small moon. They streaked across space, leaving trails of exotic particles in their wake. The torpedoes reached the Resolute and detonated against the energy absorption grid. Matter and antimatter annihilated each other, releasing staggering amounts of energy and creating miniature suns that blazed for several seconds. The Resolute absorbed every bit of it. Daniel reported that the torpedoes were completely ineffective. Shield integrity still at 100%. Reactor output now at 160 terawatts. The Zelthan were literally making the human ship stronger with every attack. The assault continued and grew more desperate. Quantum disruptors fired, exotic weapons designed to destabilize molecular bonds and tear matter apart. Energy beams of every color lanced out from the Zelthan fleet. Kinetic projectiles moving at tremendous speeds. Even experimental weapons humanity had never encountered before. Everything converged on the lone human vessel. The space around the Resolute became a maelstrom of destruction. Explosions cascaded across the shield barrier in waves of fire and brilliant light. Energy readings went completely off the charts. The fury of 200 warships focused on a single target created a light show that would be studied and analyzed for decades. And through it all, the Resolute held firm like a rock in a hurricane. On the bridge, lights flickered momentarily as power was redistributed, but the ship remained completely stable. The crew watched their displays with growing amazement and confidence as every attack was absorbed, converted, and added to their power reserves. William announced that reactor output had reached 190 terawatts. They were approaching theoretical maximum capacity. If the Zelthan kept attacking much longer, the Resolute would have more power than the crew knew what to do with. James allowed himself a slight smile. Then they should give the Zelthan something to think about. He ordered Daniel to begin deploying defensive platforms. Start with 50 units as a demonstration. Daniel acknowledged and initiated the deployment sequence. Along the Resolute's hull, dozens of hatches that had looked like simple maintenance ports suddenly opened. From within the ship's massive fabrication bays, spherical objects emerged smoothly. Each one was about 3 meters across, covered in sensor arrays and small maneuvering thrusters. They drifted away from the Resolute, taking up positions in a defensive sphere around the mothership. The platforms looked unimpressive individually, but there was something ominous about how they moved with precise coordination and purpose. Within 90 seconds, 50 platforms had deployed and activated. Daniel reported that all platforms were online. Autonomous systems active. Defensive shields up. Weapons charged and ready. They were linking through quantum communication and forming a distributed tactical network. The platforms were ready to engage targets. James opened a channel back to the Zelthan flagship. Marcus's face reappeared, but his earlier confidence had been replaced by visible confusion and the first hints of real fear. James spoke calmly, as if discussing the weather. He said Marcus had wanted to see humanity's capabilities. Now James was demonstrating. These were autonomous defense platforms. Each had its own power, shields, and weapons. They operated independently but coordinated as a network. And most importantly, James could manufacture them faster than the Zelthan could destroy them. Marcus stammered that it was impossible. No ship could fabricate complex systems in real time during combat. The power requirements alone would be impossible to meet. James interrupted to thank Marcus. The power requirements were indeed substantial, but fortunately the Zelthan had been kind enough to provide additional power with their attack. Every shot fired at the Resolute had been absorbed and converted to useful energy. The plasma lances, the torpedoes, the exotic weapons, all of it just made humanity's ship stronger. James thanked Marcus for the generous donation of energy. Marcus stared at him as comprehension slowly dawned. His voice was barely a whisper as he asked if humanity was using the Zelthan's own weapons against them. James confirmed this was essentially correct. They were using Zelthan energy to build human defenses. It was quite efficient. He asked if Marcus would like a demonstration of what these platforms could actually do in combat. Marcus insisted it was a trick, some kind of hologram or deception. The platforms could not possibly be functional weapons. James suggested Marcus test one. Choose any platform and shoot it. See what happened. After hesitating, Marcus barked orders to his fleet. A Zelthan destroyer broke formation and maneuvered closer to the nearest platform. At a range of 20,000 kilometers, it fired a full-power plasma lance that would have torn through most small vessels. The platform's shields absorbed the hit easily, as if swatting away an annoying insect. Then the platform returned fire. There was no dramatic flash or visible beam. Just a tiny projectile accelerated to 30% of light speed by the platform's electromagnetic railgun. At that velocity, it crossed the distance in less than 1 second. The impact was absolutely devastating. The projectile punched through the destroyer's shields like they were made of tissue paper. It tore through armor plating, creating a perfect circular hole 3 meters wide. The tungsten round passed completely through the ship from bow to stern, exposing interior compartments to the vacuum of space. Atmosphere vented explosively. Internal bulkheads buckled and collapsed. Critical systems failed throughout the vessel. The destroyer immediately went dark and began tumbling, completely disabled. Not destroyed, but utterly incapable of combat. One shot. One platform. One disabled warship. The entire Zelthan fleet fell into shocked, horrified silence. James let the moment sink in, then spoke quietly into that silence. At 0.3 light speed, kinetic energy was considerable. Zelthan shields were designed for energy weapons. They could not stop something with that much momentum behind it. And James had 50 platforms deployed right now. He asked politely if Marcus would like to see what 50 simultaneous impacts could do to the Zelthan fleet. Marcus's face had gone pale. His voice shook as he called it impossible. No civilization had weaponized relativistic kinetic energy to this degree. James replied that humanity had 8 years to work on that problem. Each platform had quantum-linked targeting and AI coordination. They operated as a swarm intelligence, allowing instantaneous coordination. They did not miss. And they could engage multiple targets simultaneously. James leaned forward and delivered the crushing truth. He had not stopped building. William reported that they now had 120 platforms deployed and the number was climbing rapidly. Current estimate was 300 platforms within 20 minutes. James explained patiently to Marcus that this was industrial warfare. James did not need to defeat the Zelthan fleet ship by ship in conventional combat. He just needed to build weapons faster than Marcus could destroy them. And the Resolute could build indefinitely, processing raw materials from asteroids and using the Zelthan's own weapons fire as power. Marcus's expression showed he finally understood. He had walked into a trap disguised as a battle. He could destroy some platforms, certainly, but the Resolute would build more. Every time his fleet fired weapons, they would give the human ship more energy to power its fabrication systems. It was unwinnable, a nightmare scenario no military doctrine had prepared him for. James gave Marcus 3 options. Keep attacking the Resolute and watch humanity build an endless swarm of weapons. Try to destroy the platforms and lose ships while James built replacements. Or withdraw back to Zelthan space and admit this had all been a terrible mistake. For several long seconds, Marcus said nothing. Pride warred with pragmatism on his scarred face. Everything in his culture and training screamed at him to fight, to never retreat, to prove Zelthan's superiority. But he was also a professional military officer who could read tactical displays and do mathematics. Finally, in a voice barely above a whisper, Marcus ordered James to call off the platforms. Then louder, almost shouting, he agreed to withdraw his forces. James replied calmly that this was a wise decision. Marcus had 24 hours to clear all Zelthan ships from human space. Any vessel remaining after that deadline would be considered hostile and engaged. The transmission ended. James let out a long breath he had not realized he was holding. Around him, the bridge crew erupted in cheers and relieved laughter. But James held up his hand for quiet. This was not over yet, he warned. Marcus was pulling back but not defeated. The Zelthan would analyze what happened, develop new strategies, possibly return with different tactics. William was to keep building platforms. James wanted 2,000 units deployed within 48 hours. As the Zelthan fleet began its withdrawal, jumping one by one into faster-than-light travel, James stood at the viewport watching them go. They had won this confrontation without destroying a single enemy ship. They had demonstrated capability while choosing restraint. That was the most human victory imaginable. Not through violence, but through making violence pointless. Not through destruction, but through proving destruction was unnecessary. The galaxy would never look at humanity the same way again. And that was exactly the point. The Galactic Council chambers had never seen such a crowd. Every available seat was filled, and dozens of species who normally never attended council sessions had sent representatives. The crystalline dome above was packed with floating cameras broadcasting the emergency session to billions of viewers across hundreds of worlds. Ambassador Thomas Blake stood at the human podium, looking remarkably calm despite being the center of attention from every direction. He had prepared for this moment, knowing the confrontation at the border would create shockwaves throughout galactic politics. Councillor Vera Sterling of the Viridian Assembly spoke first, her luminescent skin flashing an agitated purple color. Her voice carried accusation as she declared that humanity owed the Council an explanation. They had deployed a weapon system of unprecedented power without telling anyone. They had forced a member species to retreat through overwhelming force. These actions demanded accountability and answers. Thomas remained standing calmly, hands clasped behind his back in a relaxed posture. He replied with respect that humanity had deployed a defensive system, not an offensive weapon of aggression. The Resolute had been positioned in neutral space at the exact location Warlord Kravesh himself had specified. Humanity did not fire first. They did not pursue the Zelthan fleet when it withdrew. They simply demonstrated that attacking humanity would be strategically pointless and self-defeating. Councillor Marcus then of the Karath Dominion rose angrily, his forearms crossed over his chest. He demanded to know how disabling a destroyer with a single shot and producing unlimited weapon platforms was merely defensive. His tone suggested humanity had crossed a dangerous line. Thomas answered calmly that it was defensive because humanity used it only to defend themselves. The Zelthan had declared war on humanity without provocation. They brought 200 warships to human borders with explicit intent to conquer colonies and enslave millions of people. Humanity responded with one ship and only engaged after being fired upon first. If that was not defensive action, Thomas did not know what qualified. High Counselor Aldrin Voss raised his hand for silence. He was an ancient being whose species had led the Council for 300 years. His rare intervention made everyone pay close attention. Voss spoke in a voice that carried the weight of centuries, explaining that the Council's concern was not that humanity defended itself, but rather the manner and magnitude of that defense. In 10,000 years of recorded galactic history, No single vessel had ever demonstrated capability to defeat an entire fleet alone. This represented a fundamental shift in military dynamics that affected every species present. Thomas nodded respectfully and acknowledged the concern. But he reminded the council that humanity had been peaceful members for 30 years. In that entire time, humans had never initiated conflict, never threatened neighbors, never violated galactic law. They had simply prepared for the possibility that someone might threaten them. Councillor Maya Winters of the Archerers Coalition, usually a human ally, asked pointedly if that preparation included developing technology that made conventional military forces completely obsolete. Thomas corrected her gently. That preparation included ensuring human survival. He reminded her that humanity had a difficult, violent history. They had nearly wiped themselves out multiple times through wars, plagues, and environmental disasters. When humanity reached the stars, they swore never to be vulnerable to extinction again. The Resolute and ships like it represented that commitment. They were built not to conquer others but to ensure no one could conquer humanity. Councillor Sterling's skin shifted to angry red as she accused Thomas of playing word games. The fact remained that humanity possessed technology that could theoretically destroy any fleet in the galaxy. How could anyone trust that humans would not use this power for aggression and conquest? Thomas's reply was sharp and cut through the chamber like a blade. He asked how they trusted the Zelthan not to use their 200-ship fleet for aggression. Oh wait, he added with clear sarcasm, the Zelthan did exactly that. They declared war on a peaceful species over a minor trade dispute. They brought overwhelming force to human borders intending to conquer. And yet Thomas saw no one calling for the Zelthan to disarm or explain their military capabilities. The chamber erupted into shouting chaos. Delegates argued with each other, accusations flew in multiple languages, and the carefully maintained order of the council dissolved into loud confusion. High Councillor Voss raised both hands and released a pulse of energy that silenced everyone instantly. He declared that the council would maintain proper order and dignity. Then he turned his ancient gaze directly on Thomas and acknowledged that the Zelthan had initiated the conflict. However, he continued, the revelation of humanity's capabilities had created genuine fear among many species. What assurances could humanity provide that this technology would never be used for conquest? Thomas took a deep breath and chose his words with great care. He could offer the same assurance humanity had provided since joining the council 30 years ago, which was their word and their track record. Humans were not conquerors. They had no interest in building an empire. They simply wanted to live peacefully, develop their colonies, and contribute positively to the galactic community. Councillor Then declared loudly that words were insufficient. The council needed concrete guarantees. Perhaps independent inspections of human shipyards. Limits on the number of Resolute-class vessels humanity could construct. Technology sharing so all species had access to the fabrication capability. Thomas's response was immediate and firm. Absolutely not. Humanity would not submit to inspections that no other species faced. They would not accept limitations on defensive capabilities that others did not have. And they would not share classified military technology with anyone, for the same reason the Karath Dominion did not share their dimensional drive specifications or the Zelthan did not publish their plasma lance designs. Sterling demanded to know if Thomas expected the council to simply trust humanity on blind faith alone. Thomas answered with one word. Yes. Just as humanity trusted everyone else. He pointed out that the Viridian Assembly had biological weapons that could sterilize entire ecosystems. The Karath possessed dimensional technology that could theoretically drop asteroids on any planet. The Zelthan had plasma weapons capable of glassing continents. Every advanced species in the chamber had the capability to cause massive destruction. They trusted each other not to use these capabilities for evil purposes. Thomas was asking for the same trust extended to everyone else. The debate continued for another hour with various species voicing concerns, asking questions, and proposing restrictions. Thomas patiently answered each one, never losing his composure, always bringing the conversation back to fundamental fairness and equality. Then something unexpected happened. The chamber doors opened and Warlord Marcus Kravish entered, walking slowly toward the center floor. He looked older than he had just days ago, his posture less arrogant, his expression more thoughtful and subdued. Behind him walked Admiral Helen Thorne, a human who had defected to the Zelthan 5 years earlier. Both wore diplomatic robes rather than military uniforms. High Councillor Voss expressed surprise at their attendance, noting they had not been expected at this session. Marcus explained that he came because his actions had started the crisis. He had something important to say about the human vessel and its captain that the council needed to hear. He moved to stand before the full council, deliberately avoiding looking at Thomas. Marcus spoke in a heavy voice, explaining that he had fought in 30 years of military campaigns. He had commanded fleets in dozens of battles. He had studied warfare his entire life. And he now told the council honestly that he had never encountered an opponent like Captain James Mitchell and the Resolute. Councillor Sterling asked if he meant because of their superior technology. Marcus answered with one flat word. No. It was because of their strategy and their character. He explained that Captain Mitchell could have destroyed the entire Zelthan fleet easily. Marcus had reviewed all tactical data extensively after returning home. The human platforms could have targeted critical systems on every ship simultaneously. Mitchell could have disabled or destroyed them all within minutes. Instead, he demonstrated capability with minimal force, offered multiple chances to retreat peacefully, and showed mercy to the damaged vessel and its crew. Marcus finally looked directly at Thomas across the chamber. He stated clearly that Ambassador Blake's captain had defeated him not through violence but by demonstrating that violence would be futile and pointless. That was a far more sophisticated form of warfare than anything Marcus had studied in 3 decades of military service. It required not just technological superiority but also wisdom and restraint. Those were not the qualities of a species planning conquest. The chamber fell into stunned silence. This testimony, coming from the Zelthan warlord who had initiated the entire conflict, carried enormous weight that no one could dismiss. High Councillor Voss asked directly if Marcus was telling the council to trust humanity. Marcus replied that he was telling the council to recognize reality. Humanity possessed this technology now. No one could uninvent it or force them to surrender it. What they could do was acknowledge that humanity had used it responsibly so far and act accordingly. Marcus admitted he had made the terrible mistake of underestimating humans and treating them as weak prey. He had paid for that mistake with one damaged ship and considerable embarrassment. But it could have been catastrophically worse if the humans had chosen destruction over restraint. Marcus straightened his shoulders with visible effort and made an announcement that shocked everyone. The Zelthan Empire was formally withdrawing its declaration of war. The Emperor had authorized Marcus to negotiate a peace treaty with humanity. They sought no further conflict. And Marcus added, with words that clearly cost him pride to speak, they now respected the strength and honor that Captain Mitchell and his crew had demonstrated. Admiral Helen Thorne stepped forward and asked permission to add something. When Voss nodded approval, she began speaking about her own experience. Helen explained that she was human by birth. She had defected to the Zelthan 5 years ago because she believed her own species was weak and would never survive in the dangerous galaxy. She stated clearly that she had been completely wrong. What she witnessed at the confrontation had changed her entire perspective. Humanity was not weak at all, just different. Humans did not win through overwhelming force or aggressive expansion. They won through preparation, innovation, and sheer stubborn refusal to accept defeat no matter what. She turned to address the full council directly. Helen said she had served with both species now. The Zelthan were fierce warriors with proud traditions. Humanity were survivors, builders, and engineers who thought 10 steps ahead. Both had value and both deserved respect. Both should be judged by their actual actions, not by fear of what they might hypothetically do in the future. Councillor Then tried to interrupt, insisting this did not address the fundamental question of what to do about humanity's military capability that overshadowed everyone else. High Councillor Voss spoke suddenly, his decision surprising the entire chamber. He declared that the council would do nothing. The council could not and would not attempt to restrict any member species' right to self-defense. They could not demand that humanity submit to inspections or limitations that did not apply equally to others. To do so would violate the foundational principles of the council itself, which was equality among all member species regardless of size or power. However, Voss continued, he proposed the following compromise. Humanity would provide regular reports on military capabilities to the Council Security Committee, at the same level of detail that all other species provided. They would commit to using their technology only for defensive purposes and would not share it with non-allied species without Council approval. In return, the Council formally recognized humanity's right to defend itself by any means it deemed necessary, and affirmed that human colonies were under full Council protection. Councillor Sterling protested that this essentially gave humanity permission to build whatever they wanted without restriction. Voss replied calmly that it was no different from what the Council allowed the Karath, the Zelthan, or any other military power. The Council did not dictate how species defended themselves. They only asked that defensive capabilities not be used for aggression. Humanity had demonstrated remarkable restraint when they could have chosen destruction. They deserved the same trust extended to others. Voss raised his voice to address the full chamber and called for a vote. After a moment of hesitation, hands and various appendages raised throughout the room. Not unanimous, as Sterling and several others abstained, but a clear majority supported the proposal. The measure passed. Humanity's defensive capabilities were formally acknowledged and accepted, subject to the same reporting requirements as other military powers. The matter was legally closed. Thomas let out a breath he had been holding for what felt like hours. He formally accepted the terms on behalf of humanity and thanked the Council for their fairness. As the session began dissolving into smaller discussions and private conversations, Marcus approached Thomas directly. The warlord spoke quietly, offering a formal apology. He admitted that pride and prejudice had clouded his judgment. He had underestimated humanity and nearly provoked a catastrophic war. That behavior was unworthy of a true warrior. Thomas extended his hand in the human gesture of peace. After a moment's hesitation, Marcus grasped it firmly. Thomas accepted the apology and added his own regret that they had to demonstrate capabilities so dramatically. He expressed hope that this incident could become the foundation for better relations between their peoples. Marcus replied that perhaps it could, though it would take time. The Zelthan did not quickly forget either defeats or acts of mercy. Captain Mitchell had given them both. They would remember. As Marcus and Helen departed, Counselor Maya Winters approached Thomas with a genuine smile. She complimented him on handling a very difficult situation expertly. Thomas replied that he had good source material to work with. James Mitchell had given him exactly what was needed, which was a demonstration of capability paired perfectly with restraint. That combination was extraordinarily powerful. Maya asked what was next for Captain Mitchell and the human fleet. Thomas explained that James was being promoted to Commodore and given command of a new defensive fleet. They were accelerating construction of additional vessels. Within 2 years, humanity would have 7 Resolute-class ships deployed throughout their territory for complete protection. Maya observed thoughtfully that 7 mobile fortresses would make humanity one of the most defensible civilizations in the entire galaxy. Thomas agreed that was precisely the idea. Humanity was not interested in conquest or aggressive expansion. But they were very interested in ensuring no one could threaten them ever again. The conversation continued as delegates began filing out of the chamber, heading back to their ships and embassies. The emergency session was over. Humanity had survived the political fallout of their demonstration of power. More than survived, actually. They had been formally recognized as a legitimate military power with the right to defend themselves however they saw fit. They had turned former enemies into potential allies. And they had established a precedent that would echo through galactic politics for generations. Ambassador Thomas Blake walked out of the council chambers that day knowing that humanity had changed forever. They were no longer insignificant newcomers to be ignored or bullied. They were players in the great game of galactic politics now, with all the opportunities and dangers that entailed. The real work was just beginning. But for today, humanity had won something perhaps more valuable than any military victory. They had won respect. And in the dangerous galaxy, respect was the foundation of survival. 6 months had passed since the confrontation with the Zelthan fleet. Admiral Patricia Cole stood in the observation deck of the newly built defensive command station, watching as the Endeavour completed its final tests. The ship was beautiful and deadly, incorporating every lesson learned from the Resolute's first battle. The vessel gleamed in the sunlight reflecting off Earth below. Commodore James Mitchell approached from behind, his new uniform showing the additional rank he had earned. In the past 6 months, James had become famous throughout human space, though he clearly disliked the attention. His face showed more lines of stress than it had before. Patricia commented that the Endeavour was magnificent, explaining it had 20% better fabrication systems and improved energy absorption compared to the original Resolute. If the first ship could face 200 enemies, this one could probably handle 300. James replied quietly that he hoped they would never need to test that theory. He asked about the Foundation, the third ship under construction. Patricia reported it was ahead of schedule and would be ready for trials in 3 months. They had also started building 4 more vessels. Within a year, James would command his full fleet of 7 ships as originally planned. James nodded, but Patricia could see worry in his eyes. She asked what was bothering him. James explained there were troubling intelligence reports. Nothing concrete or definite, but concerning patterns. Unusual ship movements near human borders. Increased surveillance from species they did not normally monitor. Encrypted communications their analysts could not break. Someone was planning something, though they did not know who or what. Patricia asked who he suspected might be behind it. James admitted that was the problem. It could be the Zelthan seeking revenge. It could be another species wanting to test human defenses. It could be nothing at all, just routine military exercises being misinterpreted by nervous analysts looking for threats. Patricia suggested he did not really believe it was nothing. James confirmed he did not. He thought humanity's demonstration of capability 6 months ago had frightened some powerful species. And frightened people did unpredictable, often dangerous things. Before they could discuss further, both their communicators chimed with emergency alerts. The message was brief and alarming. Emergency Council Session. All human representatives report immediately. Priority Alpha Classification. They hurried to the communications center and within minutes connected to a holographic conference with Ambassador Thomas Blake transmitting from the council chambers. Thomas's face looked grim and exhausted. Thomas explained they had a serious situation. 3 hours earlier, the Karath Dominion had launched a surprise attack on the Viridian assembly colony called New Meridian. The Karath claimed territorial rights based on some ancient treaty, but it was clearly just a power grab and land theft. The Viridians were calling desperately for council intervention. James asked why this concerned humanity directly. Thomas answered that the Karath were testing them. They wanted to see how humanity responded to aggression against an ally. If humans did nothing, it would signal that their defensive capabilities did not extend beyond protecting their own territory. If humans intervened, it could drag them into a much wider conflict with unpredictable consequences. Patricia leaned forward and asked what the Viridians were requesting specifically. Thomas said they wanted military assistance. The Viridians formally requested that humanity deploy the Resolute to New Meridian and force the Karath to withdraw, exactly like they had done with the Zelthan 6 months ago. James protested immediately. That situation was completely different. The Zelthan had attacked humanity directly. This was a territorial dispute between 2 other species. Humans had no legal standing to intervene in someone else's war. Thomas countered that actually, they did have legal standing. Under the Mutual Defense Clause of the Council Charter, any member species could request military assistance from another member during an unprovoked attack. The Viridians had formally invoked that clause an hour ago, specifically naming humanity as their chosen defender and protector. James sat back heavily, processing the implications. He said quietly that this was a trap. Thomas agreed it probably was a trap. But it was a clever one. If humanity refused to help, they would look weak or selfish, willing to defend themselves but unwilling to help allies in need. That would undermine their position in the council and make other species less likely to support humanity in future disputes. If they accepted and intervened, they risked getting pulled into a conflict that could spiral out of control and create new enemies. James asked what Thomas recommended they do. Thomas was quiet for a long moment before answering. He thought humanity had to respond and show they honored commitments. Not with overwhelming force like they used against the Zelthan, but with enough strength to demonstrate that humanity kept its promises. Deploy the Resolute to New Meridian. Make it clear to the Karath they were making a terrible mistake. But be prepared to withdraw quickly if the situation escalated beyond control. James looked at Patricia, who nodded slowly in agreement. She said Thomas was right. Humanity could not afford to look weak right now, not when trying to establish themselves as a legitimate power. But she warned James to be extremely careful. The Karath were devious and clever. They might be using the Viridians as bait to test the Resolute against different tactics than the Zelthan had used. James said he understood and would depart within the hour. But he wanted full intelligence support, everything available on Karath military capabilities, tactical patterns, and known weapon systems. If this was a test of human abilities, James intended to pass it decisively and completely. 18 hours later, the Resolute emerged from faster-than-light travel at the edge of the New Meridian system and found absolute chaos. The Viridian colony was under heavy bombardment from a Karath fleet of approximately 40 ships. Not enough vessels to conquer the planet completely, but more than sufficient to cause massive damage and kill millions of civilians. Lieutenant Daniel Foster worked frantically at his tactical console, analyzing the enemy force. He reported 32 destroyers, 6 cruisers, and 2 command carriers. The Karath had arranged in standard siege formation around the planet, rotating bombardment patterns to maximize destruction on the ground while minimizing their own exposure to counterattack. Estimated casualties so far were 50,000 civilians and climbing rapidly with each passing hour. James asked about the colony's defensive status. Daniel answered that it was minimal. The Viridians had orbital defense platforms, but the Karath were systematically destroying them one by one. At the current rate of destruction, the planet would be completely defenseless within 6 hours, leaving millions vulnerable. James clenched his jaw in barely controlled anger. 50,000 dead already. Tens of thousands more dying every hour. This was not warfare between militaries. This was massacre of innocent civilians. He ordered communications to broadcast on all frequencies. He wanted the Carath to know the Resolute had arrived. James stood from his command chair and spoke with cold, controlled fury. He identified himself as Commodore James Mitchell of the Resolute and stated the Carath were violating Council law by attacking a member species without legitimate provocation. He ordered them to cease fire immediately and withdraw from the system. They had 30 minutes to begin complying. For several tense seconds, there was no response. Then a face appeared on the view screen that made James's blood run cold. Commander Drake Vance, leader of the Carath assault fleet, was a massive being easily 8 feet tall with 4 powerful arms and natural armor covering his body. But his voice was surprisingly refined and educated, which somehow made him more threatening. Vance said he was delighted that James had made an appearance. The Carath had been hoping humanity would show up. He asked mockingly if James really thought he could intimidate the Carath the same way he had intimidated the Zelthan. The Carath were not foolish enough to gather their entire fleet in one vulnerable location for humanity to target. James replied he was not there to intimidate anyone. He was there to enforce Council law and protect an ally. He told Vance to withdraw his forces and this would end peacefully. Vance laughed, a harsh grating sound. He asked what James would do otherwise. Build his little platforms and shoot at them? The Carath had spent 6 months studying human tactics from the Zelthan encounter. They knew the railguns relied on direct line-of-sight targeting. They knew the platforms took time to deploy. They knew the Resolute, while powerful, was still just one ship. Vance leaned closer to the screen, his eyes glinting with cruel intelligence. Most importantly, he continued, the Carath knew that James would not risk the civilian population on New Meridian. If James attacked, some Carath ships would certainly escape and complete the bombardment before being destroyed. Vance asked if James could live with those additional deaths on his conscience. James felt ice water flow through his veins. Vance was absolutely right about the tactical situation. The Carath had positioned their fleet strategically, with some ships always near the planet where firing on them would risk hitting civilians. They had turned the entire population into human shields. James said quietly that Vance was using innocent people as hostages. Vance corrected him with a smile. He was using tactical advantages, something the Zelthan had failed to do properly. Now James had a choice. He could withdraw and admit that humanity's celebrated defensive capabilities did not extend to protecting other species. Or he could attack and accept responsibility for the civilian casualties that would inevitably result from Carath ships completing their bombardment. Either way, Vance declared confidently, the Carath Dominion would win this confrontation. The transmission ended abruptly, leaving James staring at a blank screen. For a long moment, nobody on the bridge spoke. They all understood the terrible situation. Vance had learned from the Zelthan's mistakes. He had positioned his forces to minimize the Resolute's advantages while maximizing risk to innocent civilians below. Lieutenant William Carter offered hesitantly that they could deploy platforms and engage the Carath ships that were not near the planet. Take out part of their fleet and force the rest to either fight directly or flee the system. Daniel countered immediately that would leave ships close to the planet free to continue bombardment. They would trade Carath military casualties for Viridian civilian deaths. Not an acceptable outcome by any measure. Emily Harrison suggested desperately that they could evacuate the population. Get civilians off the planet before engaging the enemy fleet. James shook his head sadly. There were 2 million people on New Meridian. Even if they had sufficient transport capacity, which they did not, evacuation would take days or weeks. The Carath would destroy the planet long before they could finish evacuating everyone. The bridge fell into grim, heavy silence. They had encountered a scenario their training had not prepared them for. An enemy who had studied them carefully, adapted intelligently, and found a way to neutralize humanity's primary tactical advantages by using innocent lives as leverage. Dr. Patricia Reynolds spoke up hesitantly from her science station. She said she might have an option, but it was extremely risky and they had never tested it at this scale before. James turned to her immediately, desperate for any alternative. He told her he was listening to whatever she had. Patricia explained that the energy absorption grid did not just absorb directed energy weapons. It could theoretically absorb any form of electromagnetic radiation, including energy signatures from ship engines, weapon systems, and even life support systems. William asked if she wanted to drain their power completely. Patricia clarified not drain, but disrupt temporarily. If they reconfigured the absorption grid to emit a focused pulse instead of passively receiving energy, they could create an electromagnetic pulse that would temporarily disable every ship within 50,000 kilometers. No permanent damage, no casualties, just a complete system shutdown lasting approximately 10 to 15 minutes. Daniel's eyes widened with understanding. That would be long enough to deploy platforms and establish firing solutions on every enemy vessel. By the time Karath systems came back online, hundreds of platforms would be targeting them. They would have no choice but to surrender or face certain destruction. James asked about the risks of this untested strategy. Patricia hesitated before answering honestly. The main risk was feedback. Generating a pulse that powerful could overload the Resolute's own systems. They could end up disabling themselves along with the enemy. She estimated a 30% chance of catastrophic systems failure that would leave them helpless. James repeated quietly that there was a 30% chance of complete failure. Those were not good odds at all. Patricia nodded grimly. If the Resolute was disabled, they would be utterly helpless and the Karath would be free to finish their assault on New Meridian and possibly destroy the human ship as well. But James thought about the alternative. If they did nothing, 50,000 deaths would become 500,000, then 5 million. An entire civilization would be erased while humanity watched helplessly from orbit. He asked how long the reconfiguration would take. Patricia estimated 20 to 25 minutes of careful work. James made his decision quickly. He ordered her to do it immediately. William was to coordinate with Patricia on power distribution. Daniel was to prepare platform deployment protocols. He wanted 500 units ready to launch the instant the pulse fired. Emily was to contact the Viridian colonial government and warn them to prepare for a complete communications blackout lasting about 30 minutes. Everyone needed to shelter in place and wait. As the crew scrambled to execute orders, James sat alone with the weight of his decision. He was gambling everything on untested technology. If it failed, the Resolute could be destroyed and New Meridian would fall. But if they succeeded, millions of innocent people would live to see another day. James pulled out the photo of his daughter Lisa from his desk drawer. He looked at her smiling face and made a silent promise. He was doing this so children like her, on every world, could grow up safe and free. The reconfiguration proceeded with agonizing slowness. Each system had to be carefully adjusted, each power relay rerouted, each safety protocol modified. One mistake could cause cascade failure. Patricia announced 2 minutes remaining. Then 1 minute. Then 30 seconds as she prepared to fire. James ordered the helm to take them into the center of the Karath fleet formation, within 40,000 kilometers. Rachel protested that would put them in weapons range of every enemy ship. James said that was exactly the point. They needed to be close enough for the pulse to hit every ship simultaneously. He ordered her to do it now. The Resolute surged forward. The Karath immediately opened fire with everything they had. Patricia counted down the final seconds as plasma lances struck their shields. 5, 4, 3. More impacts rocked the ship. 2, 1. She triggered the pulse. The Resolute became a miniature star for one brilliant instant, unleashing electromagnetic fury in all directions. Every Karath ship within range went completely dark simultaneously. Engines shut down. Weapons powered off. Shields collapsed. Life support switched to emergency backup. 40 warships rendered helpless in a single moment. But the Resolute had taken damage too. The feedback hit hard. Systems overloaded throughout the ship. Lights went out. Gravity fluctuated. For a terrifying instant, James thought they had disabled themselves. Then emergency power activated. Red lights illuminated the bridge. Gravity stabilized. Critical systems began rebooting. James shouted for damage reports over the alarms. William called back that primary power was offline but secondary systems were recovering. The energy absorption grid was completely burned out and would need total replacement. They had no shields and were completely vulnerable. James asked about weapons and deployment systems. Daniel reported that platform deployment was still functional. But they were defenseless. If the Karath recovered before platforms deployed, the Resolute would be helpless. James ordered immediate deployment of all platforms using every available launcher. They could not give the Karath time to recover. Ports opened and platforms poured out like an angry swarm. 130 seconds. 200 in a minute. 500 in 3 minutes. By the time Karath ships began coming back online 5 minutes later, they found themselves surrounded by an enormous constellation of weapons, each one locked on target with railguns charged and ready to fire. Commander Vance's face reappeared on the view screen, his earlier confidence completely replaced by shock and fear. James spoke quietly into that stunned silence. He explained that humanity adapted. Vance had studied tactics from the Zelthan encounter and thought he understood human capabilities. But he had only seen what James showed the Zelthan. He had not seen everything else humanity could do when pushed to innovate. James described Vance's situation clinically. 40 disabled or recovering ships. 500 weapons platforms targeting them. Each platform capable of disabling a ship with 3 shots. Even with every platform targeting only one ship, that was over 1,000 railgun strikes. The Karath fleet would be floating scrap metal in under 2 minutes. Vance asked hoarsely what James's terms were. James replied with cold precision. Immediate withdrawal from New Meridian system. Full reparations to the Viridian Assembly for all damages caused. Formal apology submitted to the Galactic Council. And a guaranteed promise that the Karath Dominion would not engage in further unprovoked aggression against any Council member species. Vance tried to protest that the Dominion would never agree to such terms. James interrupted sharply. The Dominion had no choice. Vance had come thinking he had outsmarted humanity. He thought he had found a way to neutralize their advantages. But humanity's greatest strength was not their technology. It was their ability to adapt, to improvise, to find solutions to impossible problems. That was how humans had survived as a species through countless near extinctions. James gave Vance 5 minutes to begin withdrawing forces. For every minute past that deadline, James would destroy one Karath ship. The terms were non-negotiable and the clock was already running. Vance stared at him for a long moment, then his image disappeared from the screen. Daniel reported that yes, the Karath ships were powering engines and moving away from the planet. They were leaving the system in defeat. James ordered weapons lock maintained until every enemy vessel cleared sensor range. Then he asked William how bad the damage to the Resolute really was. William reported it was significant but repairable. The energy absorption grid was completely destroyed and would need replacement at a major shipyard. Several power conduits were fused and melted. Fabrication systems had taken minor damage. They were operating at maybe 60% capacity. They could limp home, but they were vulnerable if anyone decided to attack while they were damaged. James ordered them to set course for Earth orbit at maximum safe speed as soon as the Karath cleared the area. Emily was to send a complete report to Command and the Council including everything that happened. Full transparency about the battle, the tactics, and the damage they sustained. As the Karath fleet disappeared and the Resolute began heading home, James sank into his command chair feeling utterly exhausted. They had won, but the victory felt hollow. 63,000 Viridian civilians had died before the Resolute could intervene. Emily approached quietly and reported final casualty numbers from New Meridian. 63,000 dead from the bombardment. It could have been millions without intervention. James had saved them. James closed his eyes in pain. 63,000 people who had been alive that morning were now dead because the Karath wanted to test humanity's resolve and capabilities. Emily insisted firmly that those deaths were on Commander Vance's conscience, not on James. Vance had given the orders to bombard civilians. James did everything humanly possible to stop him and had saved nearly 2 million others. But James could not shake the weight of those deaths. He kept thinking he could have acted faster, made the decision to use the pulse weapon sooner, saved maybe a few thousand more lives. Emily told him sharply that he had impossibly high standards for himself. The 2 million people still alive on New Meridian did not care about perfect execution. They cared that humanity showed up when nobody else would. That James risked everything to protect them. That mattered more than anything. The Resolute limped toward home, damaged but victorious, having proven once again that humanity would defend not just themselves but their allies as well. The cost had been high, but the alternative would have been infinitely worse. And in the process, humanity had demonstrated something crucial to the watching galaxy. They were not just defensive. They were adaptive, innovative, and willing to take enormous risks to protect innocent lives. That message would echo across the stars for years to come. 1 year had passed since the crisis at New Meridian. The Grand Hall in Geneva had been transformed into something magnificent for this historic occasion. Representatives from 47 species filled the chamber, but everyone focused on 3 figures standing at center stage together. Ambassador Thomas Blake of Humanity, Warlord Marcus Kravesh of the Zelthan Empire, and Commander Drake Vance of the Karath Dominion stood side by side, about to sign a treaty that would change galactic politics forever. Admiral James Mitchell watched from the audience beside Admiral Patricia Cole. He wore his dress uniform and felt uncomfortable with all the media attention focused on him. Cameras from dozens of worlds recorded every moment. Patricia whispered that she never thought she would see this day. A year ago, The Zelthan wanted to conquer humanity and the Karath wanted to test them in battle. Now they were signing a mutual defense pact together. James replied quietly that stranger things had happened, though he would believe it when he saw actual signatures on the treaty document. On stage, Thomas approached the podium and addressed the gathered delegates. He spoke about how three civilizations that had recently viewed each other with suspicion and hostility were gathering to formally end all conflicts and establish a framework for lasting peace. The Zelthan Empire, the Karath Dominion, and humanity had all demonstrated military capability and proven they could fight. Today they would demonstrate something more difficult by showing they could make genuine peace. Marcus stepped forward next, looking visibly uncomfortable in diplomatic robes instead of his usual military armor. The Zelthan warlord acknowledged that his empire's declaration of war against humanity had been unjust and wrong. They had underestimated human capability and character badly. The Zelthan had sought easy conquest and instead found formidable opposition. More importantly, Marcus continued, they had found an enemy who chose mercy over vengeance when they could have destroyed the entire Zelthan fleet. That choice was worthy of deep respect. Marcus turned to face Thomas directly. He stated that humanity had proven themselves honorable adversaries and potentially valuable allies. The Zelthan Empire formally withdrew all territorial claims against human space and proposed a full mutual defense treaty. If humanity was attacked by anyone, the Zelthan fleet would defend them. In return, humanity would extend the same military protection to Zelthan colonies. The hall erupted in surprised murmuring and shocked whispers. This went far beyond a simple peace treaty. It was a complete military alliance between former enemies. Drake Vance spoke next, his massive frame somehow seeming smaller than during their confrontation at New Meridian. The Karath Dominion also acknowledged errors in judgment. They had tested humanity's resolve at New Meridian and learned a painful lesson about human adaptability and determination. They too proposed a non-aggression pact and technology sharing agreement with humanity. Vance looked directly at James sitting in the audience. He said that Admiral Mitchell had demonstrated at New Meridian that humanity would defend their allies even at great personal risk to themselves. The Karath respected strength, but they respected honor even more. They would rather have humanity as friends than as enemies. Thomas smiled and announced that these were generous offers and humanity accepted both. But he proposed something additional that made everyone lean forward with interest. A three-way alliance between the Zelthan, Karath, and humanity, all working together to provide security and stability in their region of the galaxy. They had proven they could fight each other effectively. Now they should prove they could protect each other and build something better. The signing ceremony proceeded with formal efficiency. Treaties were reviewed, signatures applied, holographic records sealed and witnessed. Within 1 hour, 3 former enemies had become formal allies bound by mutual defense agreements. But as the ceremony concluded and delegates began mingling and talking, James noticed something troubling. Several species he had considered friendly were watching the proceedings with expressions ranging from deep concern to outright hostility. Their body language showed fear and suspicion. Patricia observed quietly that those delegates were afraid. 3 of the most powerful military forces in the region had just allied together. That shifted the balance of power significantly and threatened many smaller nations. James said that was exactly what bothered him. They had spent a year building peace with the Zelthan and Karath. But how many new enemies had they just created in the process? His question was answered much faster than expected. 6 hours later, James was reviewing fleet deployment schedules aboard the Resolute in Earth orbit when an emergency alert flashed across his terminal. Multiple unauthorized faster-than-light signatures detected at the edge of human space. Configuration matched the Arcturus Coalition fleet. Estimated strength was 120 warships. No response to hailing attempts. Current trajectory aimed directly at New Hope Colony. Arrival time was 22 hours. James stared at the report in disbelief. The Arcturus Coalition had been humanity's allies and supporters since humans joined the Council. They had consistently voted in favor of human interests at every session. Why would they attack now? He immediately forwarded the alert to Admiral Cole. Within minutes, Patricia's face appeared on his screen looking grim and worried. She confirmed she had seen the report. It was definitely the Arcturus Coalition fleet, and definitely heading for New Hope at attack speed. They were not responding to any diplomatic channels or communication attempts. James asked why their allies would suddenly attack without warning or provocation. Patricia answered with one word. The treaty. The coalition was attacking because of the alliance treaty they had just signed with the Zelthan and Karath. James protested that made no sense. They were building peace, not preparing for war. Patricia explained patiently that the coalition saw it differently. They viewed the Zelthan-Karath-Human alliance as a threat to their own security. Three powers that together controlled more firepower than the next 10 species combined. That was an unacceptable concentration of military strength to the coalition leaders. So they were trying to eliminate the threat before it became fully operational. James realized with horror that their attempt to build peace had triggered a new war with former friends. He immediately issued orders recalling all 7 ships of the defensive fleet to assemble at New Hope within 20 hours. And he requested secure channels to Marcus Cravesh and Drake Vance. If the new alliance meant anything, now was the time to prove it. 18 hours later, the human defensive fleet had assembled around New Hope Colony. 7 Resolute-class ships formed a defensive wall, their fabrication bays working at maximum capacity to produce weapons platforms. James stood on the bridge of the Resolute watching the tactical display. Around him, holographic screens showed the positions of his other 6 ships. Endeavor, Foundation, Defiance, Vigilance, Guardian, and Sentinel. Each commanded by officers he had trained personally over the past year. Lieutenant Daniel Foster announced that the enemy fleet was emerging from faster-than-light travel. Confirmed as Arcturus Coalition. 123 warships including 15 heavy cruisers and 3 dreadnoughts. They were in full attack formation and weapons were hot. James asked if they were responding to hails yet. Emily Harrison reported negative. The coalition was maintaining complete communication silence and appeared committed to attack. James ordered all ships to battle stations and begin platform deployment. He wanted 3,000 defensive units in space within 10 minutes to establish a proper defensive perimeter. Across the human fleet, fabrication bays opened and platforms poured out into space like a metallic swarm. Within minutes, thousands of autonomous weapons filled the area around New Hope, each one coordinating through quantum communications. Then something unexpected happened. New faster-than-light signatures appeared throughout the system, first one, then dozens more. The Zelthan fleet emerged first. 80 warships led by Marcus Cravesh aboard the Dominion took up positions flanking the human fleet with weapons charged and targeting systems locked on the coalition forces. Moments later, the Karath arrived. 60 ships under Drake Vance's command completed the defensive triangle around New Hope Colony. Daniel reported with amazement that the full Allied fleet was now assembled. 147 ships plus thousands of human platforms. The tactical balance had shifted dramatically. A transmission came through from Counselor Maya Winters, leader of the Arcturus Coalition. She appeared on screen looking shocked and pale. Her voice shook as she asked how the Allied fleet had possibly mobilized so quickly. It had been less than 24 hours since they left Geneva. How did humanity coordinate a response this fast? James replied calmly that they meant what they said at the treaty signing. An attack on one member was an attack on all members. The moment he detected the coalition fleet approaching, he contacted their allies. The Zelthan and Karath responded immediately without hesitation because that was what real allies did for each other. Marcus Crevesh's voice cut into the channel. The Zelthan Empire stood with humanity, he declared. The coalition should withdraw their forces immediately or face all 3 allied fleets in combat. Drake Vance added his own warning. The Karath Dominion agreed completely. They would not allow unprovoked aggression against their allies. The coalition was outnumbered and outgunned. They should leave while they still could. Maya stared at the tactical displays visible on her bridge, doing rapid calculations. 123 coalition ships against 147 allied vessels, with human platforms adding firepower equivalent to another 50 ships. The odds had shifted from favorable to catastrophic for the coalition. Maya said quietly that this was madness. They were trying to prevent a war by stopping the alliance before it became too powerful. Now they had started the exact war they wanted to avoid. James corrected her gently. The coalition had tried to start a war. But it was not too late to end it peacefully. He asked Maya to pull back her fleet and return to coalition space. They could still resolve this through diplomatic channels instead of violence. Maya asked what that would accomplish. Would humanity accept that the alliance now dominated the entire region militarily? James replied that they should accept that 3 powers had chosen to defend the region cooperatively instead of fighting each other for dominance. He explained patiently that the Zelthan, Karath, and humanity had all been aggressors at different points. They had all learned the cost of aggression through painful experience. Now they were trying something different by building an alliance based on mutual defense rather than conquest. James leaned forward and spoke directly to Maya's fears. He understood she was afraid they would abuse their combined power. That fear was natural and reasonable. But the best way to prevent abuse was not to attack them. The best way was to join them. He invited the coalition to add themselves to the alliance and make it a four-way partnership. That way the coalition would have a voice in how the allied forces were used and deployed. Maya blinked in obvious surprise. James was inviting them to join the alliance they had just tried to destroy? James confirmed he was inviting them to choose peace over war. The coalition fleet had come because of fear. Fear made people do irrational things they later regretted. But it did not have to end in violence and death. They could turn this around and make something positive from the crisis. But Maya had to make the choice right now before the situation spiraled beyond anyone's control. For what felt like an eternity, Maya was silent. James could almost see the calculations happening behind her eyes, weighing pride against survival, fear against opportunity. Finally Maya spoke. She needed to consult with her government about the terms, but she was willing to discuss adding the coalition to the alliance. Assuming certain safeguards and oversight mechanisms could be agreed upon to prevent abuse of power. James said that was all he asked for. A willingness to talk instead of fight. He agreed to negotiations immediately. Maya announced that her fleet would withdraw to a holding position at the edge of the system. They would send diplomatic envoys to Geneva within 24 hours to begin formal negotiations. The transmission ended. Moments later, the coalition fleet began pulling back, their weapons powering down as they moved away from confrontation range. James let out a breath he had been holding for what felt like hours. Around him, the bridge crew erupted in relieved celebration. But James held up his hand for quiet. This crisis was resolved, but the work was just beginning. If the coalition joined the alliance, that would be four major powers working together. That was enough combined strength to stabilize the entire region of space and prevent most conflicts through deterrence alone. Marcus and Drake both appeared on communication screens to congratulate James on his diplomatic skills. Marcus observed that talking down an entire fleet was nearly as impressive as defeating one in battle. Drake added that he was surprised James offered alliance membership to a species that had just threatened human colonies with destruction. James explained it was the only logical move that made sense. If they had fought the coalition and won, they would have created a permanent enemy seeking revenge. If they had lost, humanity would be crippled. But by offering the coalition what they actually wanted, which was security and a voice in regional affairs, James had transformed a potential enemy into a potential ally. That was worth more than any military victory. Marcus nodded thoughtfully and said it was a very human way of thinking. The Zelthan would have simply crushed the threat and dealt with consequences later. But James's approach might actually create lasting peace instead of just temporary victory. After both commanders signed off, James sat alone in his ready room thinking about everything that had happened. 1 year ago, he had been captain of an experimental ship facing an enemy fleet. Now he was an admiral commanding a 7-ship fleet that formed the core of an alliance potentially reshaping galactic politics for generations. But he was tired. Exhausted by constant crises, by making decisions where people lived or died based on his judgment, by being a symbol and hero when he just wanted to be normal. He pulled out the photo of his daughter Lisa from his desk drawer. She was older now, almost 11 years old, growing up while he was constantly away dealing with one emergency after another. A message notification appeared on his screen. It was from Lisa herself. The message read that she had been accepted to the Alliance Academy in the Xenobiology program. She would be the first human in that program. Lisa knew James wanted her to attend civilian university, but she wanted to serve like he did. She asked him not to be mad and said she loved him. James stared at the message feeling pride and fear mixed together. He had spent a year trying to give Lisa a peaceful, safe life. And she had chosen to follow him into service anyway, continuing the cycle. He typed his response carefully. He was not mad, he wrote. He was proud of her. Scared, yes, but proud. They would talk tonight about what service really meant and what she was getting into. He loved her too. James sent the message and smiled despite his exhaustion. The cycle would continue. One generation protected the next, who then chose to protect the generation after them. That was how civilization survived and improved over time. He stood and walked to the viewport, looking out at the Allied fleet. Ships from 3 former enemy species now flying in coordinated formation, working together to patrol and protect. A year ago they had been ready to destroy each other. Now they were partners building something unprecedented. It was not perfect. There were still tensions, disagreements, and occasional problems. But it was real progress toward a galaxy where species cooperated instead of competed, where differences were respected instead of feared, where strength was used to protect the weak rather than dominate them. 20 years later, Captain Lisa Mitchell stood on the bridge of the Perseverance, the newest ship in the expanded Alliance fleet. Around her, a crew representing 9 different species worked together with practiced efficiency that would have been impossible a generation earlier. Her first officer reported they were approaching disputed territory. The Kravosian Empire and Telthar Collective both claimed sovereignty over the same star system. Both had deployed military assets and were preparing for war. Lisa studied the tactical display, seeing familiar patterns of escalation her father had taught her about years ago. 2 species, both afraid, both preparing to fight because they could not imagine any alternative to violence. She ordered communications open to both fleets. She would see if she could talk them down before anyone did something stupid they would regret. As the channels connected, Lisa thought about her father, now retired and teaching at civilian universities. He was still spreading the philosophy that had created the Alliance. Strength through cooperation. Security through partnership. Peace through preparation and wisdom. She had learned those lessons well from him. Now it was her generation's turn to prove they could maintain and expand what the previous generation had built through sacrifice. The communication channels opened and both alien commanders appeared on split screens, glaring at each other with barely controlled hostility. Lisa took a deep breath and began speaking with the authority of the Alliance and the wisdom of 20 years of hard-won peace behind her words. She introduced herself as Captain Mitchell of the Alliance Defense Initiative. She understood both civilizations believed they had legitimate claim to the disputed territory. She was there to propose a different solution, one where neither side had to lose and both could gain something better than military victory. She offered them partnership and cooperation instead of war. As she spoke, offering the same choice her father had offered so many times before, she knew the cycle would continue forever. Every generation faced their own unique challenges. Every generation had to choose between peace and war. Every generation had to prove they could build rather than destroy. But they did not start from nothing. They started with the foundation her father's generation had built through courage and sacrifice. With the alliance that now protected dozens of species across hundreds of worlds. With the living example that proved cooperation was possible even between former bitter enemies. That was the real legacy of James Mitchell and the Resolute. Not a single battle won or crisis resolved, but a philosophy that echoed across generations and would continue long after everyone involved was gone. They did not fight to prove they were strong. They fought to prove that fighting was unnecessary. They built weapons not to conquer but to make conquest impossible. They sought not victory but lasting peace. And slowly, one crisis at a time, one choice at a time, one generation at a time, they were succeeding in building a better galaxy. The work was never finished. It never would be. But it was work worth doing, and that made all the difference.